And then she would inject extract of rosemary into this brain soup. And she also injected extract of sage, another mint relative. And then she also injected lemon balm. Lemon balm did even better than rosemary and sage at preventing the breakdown of acetylcholine, at least in that human brain soup. So my anti-Alzheimer's shampoo today would consist of all three of those, sage, lemon balm, and rosemary, all of which have been demonstrated, at least in these tissue cultures, to prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine. Yes?
I don't know if I missed something here, but why are these numbers and parameters?
I never told you why. Thank you for asking that question. The higher the number, the better my ranking of its efficacy.
And what about the parens after the name of the herb? Like D3?
That just tells you the name of the plot in my garden. This is a map of my garden. But like I've got just 1 and 1 after the fever for allergies. But under allergy I've got garlic and ginkgo with a 2. And the stinging nettle. Those are. This tells me that for allergy I would bet more on the garlic and the ginkgo and the stinging nettle. And for Alzheimer's, you see I've got the rosemary with the 3 and the sage with the 2. This was done before that experiment with the brain soup in Great Britain. At this point I would add lemon balm with the 3 and raise my sage to a 3. And the horse balm over there has a 3 because it was richer in the acetylcholine sparing compounds than either the rosemary or the sage or the lemon balm. The ginkgo gets a 2 there, and I was delighted to see, even in the Journal of the American Medical Association last year, an article saying that ginkgo slowed senile dementia. Now, if I were taking my rosemary shampoo for Alzheimer's, I would also take the ginkgo because it would speed up cerebral circulation, thereby getting the active compounds in these mints to the desired area. Angina. Angelica is an herb that we don't hear much about here in the United States, but I mention Angelica because it contains 15 known calcium blockers. 15 different compounds, some of them coumarins. The bilberry, I give it a 2, it's pretty good too. Bishop's weed a 2, and the celery 1. But that Angelica with those 15 calcium blockers is so potent.
Angelica?
Yes, precisely. Not Don Quai, but Angelica, Angelica. And the studies were done in Finland that named these 15 different compounds, with one of them alone was equivalent to verapamil, one of the synthetic calcium blockers. Matter of fact, I think it might even be dangerous to take Angelica with grapefruit, because grapefruit juice potentiates calcium blockers. I suspect it would potentiate natural calcium blockers as well. I have no hard evidence on this, but it turns out that grapefruit juice can potentiate about 1/3 of all drugs that have been studied with it. This can be good, this can be bad.
Are they the calcium blockers they use with heart disease?
Yes.
So it's like ACE, like the ACE inhibitor?
The angiotensin converting enzyme. No, you got the angiotensin converting enzymes, that's the A, then you got the B, the beta blockers, and then you got the calcium blockers. You got 3 different approaches, but the ones that are in the Angelica are more like the calcium blockers, like verapamil specifically. But let me get back to that grapefruit juice. Everything has an upside and a downside. The so-called AIDS cocktail, I think, is estimated to cost about $18,000 a year now. That's 3 different drugs. But one of those three is potentiated by grapefruit juice. Now, instead of worrying about this, what we should be doing is studying so that we could predict and we could lower the dosage of that herb that drug 2/3 by taking with grapefruit juice. That would be, I think, a very useful contribution, and could save $4,000 a year by using the grapefruit juice. But grapefruit juice is clearly something that has to be watched out for with any drug that you're taking, because the odds are that in 1 chance out of 3, it's going to potentiate that drug. That can be good or bad. If you can lower your dose and can do it predictably, you're better off health-wise. I suppose we should talk about aphrodisiacs. I note ashwagandha there. That reminds me of my trip to Kenya and Tanzania. 3 different ethnic groups took me to the ashwagandha, which is a weed there. It's an Ayurvedic herb here. And in 3 different languages, none of which I understood, they always said, That is the universal language for aphrodisiac. And that's part of why I raised it to a 2. But I'd like to mention epimedium there. Epimedium is the so-called horny goat weed. Now, I have one of the biggest collections of epimedium there is now. I think the 2nd biggest on the East Coast, because I think it's going to have some Viagra-like activity. But of the herbs there, yohimbe is the one that comes closest to Viagra, but it's got some rather dangerous side effects. The velvet bean is listed there because it too is a source of L-dopa, like the fava bean. Now, why would I have the fava bean and the velvet bean there as aphrodisiacs? It turns out that one of the side effects of L-dopa in Parkinsonian patients is priapism, and it does have this aphrodisiac side effect, not in all patients, but that's why the velvet bean is there. Yohimbe is an alkaloid in the herb yohimbe, and that one is dangerous for the blood pressure, but it certainly has some proven activity. Now, arthritis is on most of us old folks' mind, and here I'm going to give you a surprise. The herb that I take most, the only herb I take every day, is celery seed for the prevention of gout. It was over 3 years ago when I saw an ad suggesting that celery seed extract had hypouricemic activity. That's the buzzword for lowering uric acid levels in the blood. Now, my first attack of gout was at age 49, and for a while I tried to control it dietarily and was pretty successful. But when you're going to the Amazon, you can't afford an attack of gout because you can hardly walk with gout. So I would take the drug called allopurinol. Finally, past midlife crisis, I am hooked on a pharmaceutical for life, allopurinol, because it too is hypouricemic. It prevents high levels of uric acid. And I was such a good test case that when I saw that celery seed could lower the uric acid levels, I emailed the guy who was advertising and told him my case history. I'm such that if I forgot to take my allopurinol and drank a 6-pack of cheap beer, I would have the hangover in my toe the next day. I would have an attack of gout in my metatarsals caused by the deposition of the crystals there. And I said I would like to try the celery seed. And I started 3 years ago, and I've yet to have an attack since then. It's still just anecdote, but I was happy to be in Australia just last week, and they had clinical evidence with rats showing that they could prevent the swelling that was associated with the gout. So the celery seed does clearly have some active ingredients, but I still don't know what it is. But celery seed is the only medicine I take every day, hoping to prevent that attack of gout. And here I am 3 years, a 3-year anecdote, no attack of gout. In the arthritis column, there's an Ayurvedic herb, Boswellia, that's got an awful lot of good evidence, and ginger. Ginger, the herb, contains several cyclooxygenase inhibitors, which makes it very good for arthritis. And red pepper, I've given that a 3 there. That's my highest score for arthritis. And red pepper is sort of an anomaly. Columbus set out looking for black Indians and black pepper, and instead he found America and red Indians and red pepper, and he changed the cuisine of the world. Until Columbus got here, no one outside America knew capsaicin, the active ingredient in the hot pepper. Capsaicin works 2 ways to help the pain of arthritis. One way is by increasing your internal endorphins, as they call your own opiates. And the other is by interfering with the transmission of pain. So those are 2 mechanisms by which capsaicin, either topically or ingested. I don't know about smoked, Andrew, but but topically or ingested, capsaicin does have those 2 mechanisms for controlling pain. And when I go to the database and ask for what's the best food source of salicylates, out comes the hot pepper. So it's also got its own aspirin if you eat the whole pepper. So the whole pepper is better than just pure capsaicin if controlling pain is what you're after. In this same column we have the turmeric. Turmeric and ginger are close kin, and turmeric and ginger have been used for thousands of years in Ayurvedic and more lately in Chinese medicine for whatever itis you have. Itis means inflammation. And it turns out that they have these cyclooxygenase inhibitors, which is getting all the press this year as the miracle aspirin. And I think you'll be much safer taking turmeric or ginger than you would taking Vioxx or Celebrex, the 2 miracle aspirin that they're promoting this year, new synthetics that will cause problems. For the asthma there, we have a whole list of things, including coffee, tea, etc. If you come to the Amazon with me, and we sometimes have as many as 120 people playing musical chairs between 3 camps that we have there. When you've got 100 people there, one person is going to have a theophylline inhaler for asthma. Theophylline is named for the old name for tea, which used to be Theophila. But tea, coffee, cola, guarana, and chocolate, cacao, all contain caffeine, theobromine, and theophylline. Each of these 3 compounds have anti-asthmatic properties. So if you had a bad attack of asthma and were accustomed to your theophylline aspirator, and you jumped in the canoe this morning without your aspirator and had an attack, I could probably save your life by having you munch on a chocolate bean, because you would be getting doses of caffeine, theophylline, and theobromine. Our monkeys down there are so smart they don't even eat the seed of the chocolate. As a matter of fact, they'll suck the white pulp around the seed as they walk through the jungle and then throw the seed out. Those caffeine, theophylline, and theobromine are rather bitter alkaloids, and they really discourage most people from eating this seed, most animals. And that's why we have to process it so much to make the beverage that we enjoy so much. But they are antioxidant compounds, but they're anti-asthmatic compounds. Backache, lower back pain, you've got the red pepper there again because of its capsaicin. You've got the willow towards the end there because of its salicylates. And then you got peppermint, spearmint, and thyme, other members of the mint family, because many of the aromatic chemicals in the mint family will go through the skin. And especially those that smell like thyme, caraway, the compounds of thymol and carvacrol that occur in many of those, they will go through the skin, and they have spasmolytic, they break up cramping, and they're very good for backaches, even transdermally. I didn't stress that so much when I was talking about the rosemary compounds. They will go right through the skin. That's why I suggested a rosemary shampoo, because that's where you get your best transdermal absorption, where you have pores. And that's why I showed you the lavender, because the lavender goes through in 2 minutes. That's probably also true of most of the aromatic compounds in rosemary. And I just wanted to walk through a few of those for you, just so you could see that we've got a whole bunch of things there. And go back to the last page of the article there, where we've got ulcers and yeast and that sort of thing, because I wanted to comment on licorice for ulcers. Back in 1991, when I first went to the Amazon, I went down with a cervical collar. I had had my first slip disc, and I had never had such pain in my life. And I never took so many drugs in my life. And I was taking more herbs then than I was at any time in my life, mostly to counteract the side effects of the drugs I was taking. For the pain of the slip disc, I was taking all sorts of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory compounds, like the aspirin and the more serious ones. And one of their major side effects is causing ulcers. So this was the only time that I was taking licorice seriously, to counteract the side effects of the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory compounds. I don't have high blood pressure, so I don't worry about licorice, but it's one of those things that one should be warned about. Licorice can have side effects of raising the blood pressure, and it can also lower your potassium levels. That's going to take us to our very next printout, handout. Called Duke's Dozen. This is probably the most boring handout you'll ever see in your life. And it's all available online at my website. But this is what irritates my sponsors here in Utah more than anything, especially the contraindication thing down here. This is the format for what I call my Herbal Desk Reference. And my Herbal Desk Reference gives the activities that you see up there, and then it gives the indications that you see, and it gives dosages compiled from the literature and from the herb bottles themselves. And then every time I see something published that's bad about an herb, I have to put that in this contraindications, etc., side effects down below. And this is offending a lot of herbal people, but if we're going to take all of the good side of the herb, we've at least got to mention the downsides, whether they're true or false. Bilberry is one of the Duke's dozen, and there are actually 13 in my dozen. But I have this in the online for over 200 herbs, not just for the 13. But I just thought I would introduce you with the Herbal Desk reference approach to the 13 that I take most frequently. And let's walk through those. Bilberry I'm taking hoping to prevent this degenerative eyesight. My cousin was just operated on for maculitis. I think bilberry can help prevent that. The celery seed, next, I was taking for the prevention of gout. Echinacea on page 3 there, I was taking for the prevention of everything. Evening primrose on page 4, I'm taking for alleviation of the symptoms of benign prostatic hypertrophy and PMS. A ginkgo, I take hoping to prevent impaired peripheral circulation. My mother and her mother both lived to be close to 100, and their memory was good all the way. But I don't think I'm going to get Alzheimer's, but if I were worried about Alzheimer's, I would be taking ginkgo. I do have impaired peripheral circulation, and I think the ginkgo helps in that regard, especially for Raynaud's syndrome. Then hawthorn on page 10, I hope. I am taking for the prevention of heart disease. I don't have heart disease in my family, but on trips like this where you're changing time zones every other day and got a lot of stress, I just might. That's why I'm taking the hawthorn, hoping to prevent more serious heart problems. The horse chestnut, I mentioned this morning, for the prevention of vascular spiders and chronic venous insufficiency. And Kava. Kava I take for the stress of travels like this. If there's an herbal tranquilizer out there, I think Kava is one of the best ones. And then the milk thistle I take when I'm on the road, breathing in the fumes of the airplanes and the fumes of the wine bottles that are too generously plied over in Australia. And then the St. John's wort I only take in December and January. Even though I look pretty morose sometimes, I'm not a depressed sort. But when the days get shorter, I do get seasonal, I get a sinking feeling. And that's when I take the St. John's wort. Now, I actually got the sinking feeling in Australia last week. Remember, I came from the winter solstice in Australia to the summer solstice here, all in one long, long day. And I didn't even have any St. John's wort with me, but coming back to the long days, I'm well again. So sunshine or St. John's wort will do the same thing. Or a trip to Brazil in the middle of winter, or Peru in the middle of winter. Saw palmetto is clearly indicated in 70% of males my age. Saw palmetto, 70%. If your age, beyond 50, your age is the percentage of people, males, who are liable to have a benign prostatic hypertrophy. And then the turmeric I'm taking for the arthritis. I have an arthritic knee here. I blame it on jogging. Mrs. Duke blames it even more. She doesn't believe in exercise. I still believe in exercise, but the jogging clearly messed up this knee. And I take glucosamine and chondroitin, which aren't herbal, for that same. I think they're rebuilding the collagen in this joint. This is the joint that went out on a ruin in Maya country last year that forced me to take 7 pharmaceuticals, 7 Aleve tablets. Now let's go through at least one of these in detail so that it'll mean something to you when you look up any of the 200 herbs that are on the database. This is just the 13 that I take most frequently. We have the scientific name in parentheses there with the authority, Linnaeus. And we've got 3 pluses there. That's my highest score for safety. And the OTC means it's an over-the-counter thing. Activities are things that I think you can now use for these herbs since DSHEA, the Dietary Supplement Health Education Act, I think you can say that bilberry is anti-aggregant, and we've got a 1 there. That tells me that it's at least one chemical in it has anti-aggregant activity. And then the PED tells me cryptically where I got that information, from a Utah source, Dr. Peterson, with one of the herb companies here in Utah. And then anti-edemic, 1, and that's not real strong. I don't have any real strong activity data here because I found nothing that would show that bilberry clinically would do these things. On the other hand, under indications, we have a few 2s. For example, for diarrhea, we have a 2. Anytime I saw that an herb was approved by commissionee, and that's indicated by the KOM here, it automatically got a 2. So for safety, this is one of the safest of herbs. As a matter of fact, it's a food. You could consider it just like a blueberry. Matter of fact, it is a blueberry. It's just got twice as much of the active ingredient, the anthocyanosides. Now in the dosages, you've got all sorts of dosages that I've found in the literature, and usually they balance out pretty well. And then under the contraindications, interactions, and side effects, you'll see some of the things. This one, you don't have much going against it. Too much of any berry can cause diarrhea, and here's an herb that works both ways. I didn't show you my plantain this morning, but America is a constipated country. We import Metamucil basic ingredients from India. That is psyllium, P-S-Y-L-L-I-U-M. If you're constipated, psyllium will loosen you up. However, if you have diarrhea, it will tighten you up. That's another case where the herb is working in both directions. That's also true of some of the pectins. And bilberry, if you're tight, it'll loosen you up. If you're loose, it'll tighten you up because of these pectinaceous-like compounds. Okay, that was her question. Was I put them in there if it was true or not? Last month, I think the most asinine study I ever saw came out from Loma Linda University. And they were studying echinacea, ginkgo, saw palmetto, and one more of the major herbs here in the U.S. And they steeped human sperm in the herb tea. And then they tried to get this human sperm to mount, I believe it was maybe a hamster egg. And it didn't do it. I'm going to make a cartoon of this for my slides. And they concluded from this that all these herbs had fertility impairment. It's published, and it's not in here yet, but I've got to put it in there. And I've got to say pretty much what I said to you. I think it should get the award of the year for terrible. And that cholesterol study on garlic, it didn't show that garlic didn't lower cholesterol. It showed that Tegra didn't lower cholesterol. And Tegra ain't the whole herb. Tegra is something that lacked 2 of the major, or actually 4 of the major active ingredients. Others in the echinacea was very much bad mouth this year because Lucinda Miller, a doctor of pharmacy, but that's not a PhD, it's a regular degree. She made the mistake of saying that taking echinacea for 3 weeks or more could cause liver damage. Now, this is what they call a hypothetical thing, because she saw that it contains pyrrolizidine alkaloids. That's true. It does contain pyrrolizidine alkaloids. but at very, very low levels, and more specifically, the kinds of pyrrolizidine alkaloids it contains are not the same that are in borage and senecio and comfrey, which in much larger quantities can cause hepatotoxicity. But she has a whole book out, and it's going to hit the fan, and it's going to double my length of counterindication, and it's mostly bunco.
Are they going to ever get it?
No, but we keep trying. The other question is, are they going to ever get it? I'm devoting what I call my sunrise years to two objectives. One is to get a fair shake for the herbal alternative, and that constitutes your next and last handout from Jim Duke, the herbal alternative. Bruce Ames, many years ago, a rather conservative chemist down in California, put out a paper called the BURP. No, he called it the HERP Index, Human Exposure Rodent Potency. And he was trying to show that a lot of the compounds in our plants were very dangerous. And I rearranged his data and came out with some opposite conclusions. But he showed that safrole, S-A-F-R-O-L-E, the active ingredient, one active ingredient is sassafras, caused cancer. And that's what he was studying, the cancer-causing potential of these compounds in rats. He also showed that the formalin in Coca-Cola, well, he said tap water he gave a 0. But even the formalin in tap water has a cancer-causing potential. Then came the alar scare. And he showed that apples with this alar pesticide, the juice from that, would be 8 times more carcinogenic than tap water. So then people got scared after Meryl Streep went out against alar and switched to orange juice. But even natural orange juice contains ethanol, the same stuff that's in the beer, at a level that made the orange juice that they were substituting for the alar contaminated apple juice 10 times worse than the apple juice. He showed that the sassafras was, I think, 200 times, a sassafras tea would have been 200 times more carcinogenic than tap water. And usually by the time I've gotten this far, my audience is ready to throw cans at me because I'm talking about some of their favorite herbs. Borage was bad mouth because it too contains pyrrolizidine alkaloids. Comfrey was bad mouth because of its pyrrolizidine alkaloids. But then, after the safrole, I calculated that a Blue Ribbon beer, for the alcohol that it contained, was 13 times more carcinogenic than a can of the old-fashioned root beer with its safrole in it. And I had a good friend in the FDA then. I called him. I said, hey, if you guys ban sassafras because it contains safrole, why don't you ban Blue Ribbon because it contains alcohol? Because it's 13 times worse than what you ban. And his answer was, well, sassafras doesn't have a lobby. But these things are all relative, and all chemicals, when taken out of context, I say, can be dangerous.
Out of their whole state.
Yeah.
We learned that the greatest cell proliferants were in the actual, had the highest source of pyrrolizidine alkaloids. That's kind of ironic that those would have the highest alkaloids, but also have the greatest cell proliferation activity.
Yeah, cell proliferation of a damaged liver can be good. Well, let me get on with this so that I'll make sure that we've made it through the morning. Here I repeat some of the first things that, and we can find the missing 5th ailment. Yes, I gave you 4 things this morning. If your doctor has diagnosed you correctly, and in Lyme disease he or she is wrong 50% of the time. And that's also true of many other diseases. So, but if all 5 of those things are there, then I think maybe the pharmaceutical might be the best thing for you. But if you can't satisfy all 5 of those lists, then the herb with its many, many constituents will be more liable to help you. Now on the 4th page of this handout starts a huge list of herbal alternatives. And I'm finally getting around to answering your question. I'm devoting my sunrise years to trying to get a fair shake for the herbal alternative. Neither you, nor your physician, nor I, nor my physician knows whether feverfew is better for migraine than sumatriptan, Glaxo's new drug. They're not going to know until they have clinical trials of both. You and I suspect would guess that the herb would be safer. But the herb feverfew does have its own side effects. It can cause mouth ulcers. Is St. John's wort better than Zoloft or sertraline? Nobody knows until they've been clinically compared. I would bet on the herbal alternative. As a matter of fact, I'm delighted to say that Duke University, no relation, is about to, in its first year of a comparison trial of sertraline or Zoloft with St. John's wort. I'll predict what's going to be the outcome within 2.5 years. I'll predict that they will say that St. John's wort is almost as good or as good as sertraline or Zoloft and has fewer side effects. That's my prediction. And that's, I think, what would be the predicted outcome of most of these lists here, where we've got aloe for burns, and the pharmaceutical alternative over there is Silvadine, and you got the Bilberry for diarrhea. I think that there's a logical reason to use the herbal alternative as opposed to the pharmaceutical, and I think it's mainly due to the fact that your genes know the chemicals in most of these herbs. And with that, I think I'll finally take you to the slides. This also is available online in case you want to manipulate it. Any of the things that I've given you in handouts today will be available online. Do not write this down. This has been replaced. It's Duke now in the middle there, but you got that on the card here if you want. But my email address is still the same, and between trips I respond rather readily to the email. Now I'm going to take you on an evolutionary recapitulation. And when we were in Africa, I saw at least 3 genera of primates. Hey, long time no see. Self-medicating. As a matter of fact, one was self-medicating with an American species that had gotten there since Columbus, a species of Tagetes. But I figured that if primates are smart enough to learn how to self-medicate, that maybe we human beings can do it too. And you'll notice I keep talking about the bitter herbs. Genistein is one of the bitter compounds in soybean. Oriental soybeans are more bitter than American soybeans, and Oriental soybeans have more genistein than American soybeans. We tend to breathe them out. As a matter of fact, the USDA has bred out 5 different kinds of anti-cancer compounds in soybean and making it more suitable to the so-called American palate. But at least 5 million years ago, our ancestors were experimenting over in Africa. And this I push back to 4 million years ago. They think that Homo the genus, if not Homo sapiens, certainly evolved in the Rift Valley there, if you believe in evolution. And this is the Rift Valley where the Leakers did all their work. And that's where there are a lot of genistein-containing compounds. And your genes came to you from your mother, came to her from her mother, all the way on back. So your genes have had a lot of experience with these phytochemicals. Then having originated in the Rift Valley, man migrated in many directions, including to South Africa and up to Northern Africa, where there's still quite a bit of activity today. And the the Bible contains references to over 100 different herbs, many of them still today important herbs. The bitter herbs are usually referred to as the dandelion that I mentioned today. Chicory that I may or may not have mentioned, but that is chicory illustrated there in that particular illustration. And then little by little we started getting, we thought, smarter, and we started concentrating our herbs and extracting them and all that jazz. And get more concentrated and getting away. And then 1950s, the antibiotics came out, and herbal medicine really took a blow. But now, as I mentioned this morning, the vancomycin is about to fail, and we may be going right back where we started from. And the bitter herbs of the Bible may in fact be it. Now, I'm particularly happy to have the chicory there, because 2 years ago at the Vancouver Conference on AIDS, they talked about a Bolivian medicinal plant that had a compound in it that had anti-integrase activity. Mark my word, that's going to be the next anti-AIDS buzzword, anti-integrase activity. And then they said this compound looks very similar to a synthetic compound known as L-chicoic acid. And my lights went off. Hey, that sounds like chicory. Chicory is C-H-I-C-O-R-Y. Its scientific name is Cichorium, C-I-C-H-O-R-I-U-M. And I almost got stung picking a borage this morning that I hoped was a chicory that I could bring into you. Because I said, well, I bet that ain't a synthetic compound. They said that chicoic acid was a synthetic compound. I hope I said that correctly. But it is a natural compound, and it does occur in chicory. It was named after chicory. So then I went to the database again. I said, database, what's the best source of chicoic acid? And out came America's #1 selling herb. What is it? Echinacea. Also in the chicory or daisy family. And that's why I mentioned the chicory with your salsify and some of the other members of this family. And your inulin occurs in the chicory as well. As a matter of fact, the roots of chicory, which shows up in Louisiana coffee, are one of the best sources of inulin. And almost all of the roots in the daisy family that contain inulin are scorched to make coffee substitutes. This one I like particularly since I was going to Australia recently, but it gives my early estimates of how long man had co-evolved with the plants around him. And now I've pushed my African man back to 4 million years. And Jammu over in Indonesia and China, there have been human beings in China, India, and Indonesia for at least 1 million years. I should say human beings in the sense of Homo the genus. And in Australia, they've pretty well pushed the Australian Aborigines back to 60,000 years. And our American Indians have, most people would say, 25,000 years at most. So the American Indians have had less time to co-evolve with their flora than any other ethnic group. Of course, we Caucasians got here to America 500 years ago. But the amazing thing about the Amazon that I want to take you to is not only is it the most diverse in the way of species, but it's the least studied. There are 90,000 of the 250,000 plant species in the world in Latin America, most of them in the Amazon. And neither Amerindians nor Caucasians have had nearly as much time to experiment with them as has been true of the other continents. I once copied this chart trying to make the argument, when are they going to get the message that drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, do kill a lot of us, and the allopaths in my arguments, in my audience, really question that pharmaceutical figure of 100,000 a year. And I quoted them, well, I don't know where they picked up this figure, but I had seen a figure in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, many years ago that 1 out of 1,000 people who go to the hospital will get killed by the drug that they take. But since then, this new one has come out, and this is based on 3 of 1,000 people in the hospital being killed by the pharmaceutical that they are given in the hospital. And this is from the Journal of the American Medical Association. Now, regardless of which figure you believe, I've seen figures as low as 6%, 6% of Americans are taking herbs, and I've seen figures as high as 60% North American are taking herbs. And let's just assume that 99% are taking pharmaceuticals. You would think that if the herbs were as dangerous as they're letting out, that we would hear a whole lot more deaths due to herbal medicine. But the very few cases that we do get are mostly due to abuse with ephedra or mahuang, usually abused for weightlifting purposes or for getting high, wired, or for losing weight. And fen-phen, too, has killed a few people trying to lose weight. But this was variously interpreted, depending on who you read, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, to indicate that pharmaceuticals were either the 4th or the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. Herbs ain't. Now, remember that the Herbal Desk Reference has over 200 of these interests, and red clover was not in one handed out to you. But here you see among the activities for the red clover that I brought in this morning, anti-angiogenic. That's a buzzword for preventing new blood vessels to cancers. If you have a cancer 1 millimeter in diameter, then probably all of us are getting cancers chronically if they just don't take off. But if yours has developed to the point of 1 millimeter, it won't grow anymore unless it gets its own blood supply. And that's why Dr. Judah Folkman up at Harvard Children's Hospital in Boston is looking at all the anti-angiogenic compounds, because they will stop the development of the blood vessels. And Andrew, that's another case where that's a good and a bad thing depending on what you're up to. But Dr. Folkman also says that most diabetic blindness is caused by malfunction in new blood vessels in the back of the eye there. So he looks at anti-angiogenic properties not only for stopping cancers but for preventing diabetic blindness. Anti-inflammatory compounds are there, diuretic compounds are there, and the 4 that I named this morning, the estrogenic compounds are there, and the expectorant compounds. So the indications are there, and we don't have much on the posology or dosages there. 3 to 6 grams of dry flowers. I've never taken the dry flowers. I frequently eat the fresh flowers, or a capsule. And since I'm fresh back from Australia, I would like to add that Australia has a brand new product out called Promensil, Promensil, which is a standardized extract of red clover, standardized to give you 40 milligrams of estrogenic isoflavones in its natural mix, the ratio that they occur in the plant. But this all started because in Australia, lots of times cattle turn loose on clover, would eat too much clover, and would abort due to overdoses of these estrogenic compounds. So anything can be overdosed, and too much estrogen can be bad. As I mentioned this morning, it's long been said that soybean was the only source of genistein. And this gives me a good point to mention. In 1991, I was at a NCI, National Cancer Institute, symposium on soy for cancer prevention. We had Kenneth Setchell, Stephen Barnes there, who was saying Genistein is why clover or soy prevents cancer. And Dr. Setchell, after the meeting, wrote me at the USDA and says, Duke, I would like to analyze a whole lot of varieties of soybean to see which is richest in genistein. How much would you charge? I said, well, I'm a government employee, so I couldn't charge. Rather, instead, I would like to send you several soybeans, and then I'd like you to look at several other kinds of beans, because I suspect they contain genistein as well. So I got together 75 different legumes and mailed them off to Dr. Setchell, and I never heard from him again. He is on soybean research funds, and the data that he must have found were not appealing to them, because at that time they all said, including him and Dr. Barnes in Alabama, that soy was a unique source of genistein. And as this table, I finally had to send off my legumes to a second scientist who didn't have any vested interest. And we found that many legumes contain genistein and daidzein, some at levels much higher than the soy itself. Remember the kudzu root that I mentioned? It's got, 10 times more than the soy. And it's got more of that daidzein, the anti-alcoholic compound as well. So if you are of the belief that estrogenic isoflavones will prevent breast cancer, and I say if because it's arguable, then you might as well take black beans as soybeans. And that's...
How would you get the first one, the Serene?
Good question. How would you get the first one? You would have to be in Ayurvedic or in China. Sorelia carlifolia is not a food plant. And it's incredibly high on the scale, and it also contains psoralen, P-S-O-R-A-L-E-N. So I would not recommend that as a food, but if you were looking for a annual or easily harvested source of genistein and or daidzein, it's the best. But remember, I don't argue for pure genistein or pure daidzein. I argue for food, and because that's what your genes know, in the ratios that your genes know. But this just sort of shot the old myth out of the water. I'm not anti-soy. Matter of fact, soy is a good plant. It's Chinese and less liable to help an American Indian than it is to help a Chinese, because the American Indian evolved with the anasazi and the red kidney beans there and the lima beans, which are American species unknown outside of America until Columbus. So there are lots of sources of these estrogenic isoflavones out there. Also in my database, you can go and ask the biological activities of any compound out there. And that first one would scare you to death. But yeah, any of these estrogenic isoflavones in huge quantities can cause abortion. Now, in this, which is called the biological activities run, it gives you abortifacient, and 52 is a cryptic source, but you can call out the full source if you wanted to look it up where I got that. We were talking about cataracts. Aldose reductase inhibitory activity could help prevent cataracts, and so the genistein might help with cataracts. And here we even have that IC50 that I mentioned of 10 micromoles from Phytochemistry, volume 23, page 1885. Anti-aggregant means that genistein is another of the many, many natural compounds that will thin the blood, slowing down clotting. Get too many and you might have a bleeding crisis. Then there's that anti-angiogenic at 150 micromoles. At least according to a study on Medline, that's what the MED stands for, that they attributed this with preventing breast cancer, Andrew. So you got arguments on both sides of this. Take your choice. When you're given the choice, and with a clear, arguable, I think you're safer going with the natural than with the synthetic, if for no other reason that your genes already know it. And your homeostatic human body tries to keep you within bounds for these things with adverse side effects. Here's the early version of the echinacea. You've got the much more expanded version in your handout in the 13 herbs that I gave to you, but remember there are over 200 on the database in the herbal desk reference. Interesting. Now here I tell, for Andrew's benefit, I don't worry about these two pyrrolizidine alkaloids, isotussilargine and tussilargine, that are reported from echinacea. But in a new science that I call nitpickology, you go and you worry to death if we said anything that contains a salicylate. If you're a nitpickologist, you will say, well, be careful about Rye syndrome, or be careful about thinning your blood. And remember, I said all plants contain salicylates. So you have to put that on every label here. Watch out for Rye syndrome. Many years ago, even in the Journal of the American Medical Association, you could find ads for DES as a good guy. Of course, that's since been shown not to be true. And in the world upside, that's not that critical to my argument. Just back for this is an interesting slide that I think might turn you on to. But I mentioned the expensive urine, that the way the quackbusters used to talk about the vitamins and the minerals, and doctors were taking more vitamins lately than are prescribing them. But 10 years ago, the pharmaceutical firms were buying up all the vitamin manufacturers at the same time as JAMA, and the doctors were bad-mouthing them. Now we have a parallel in the herb world, and I'm not sure that's good. But today, especially last year, there have been all these concerted attacks about how an herb tea will prevent your sperm from mounting a hamster's egg. But I think within 5 years there'll be doctors taking herbs more frequently than are prescribing them. And I think it's the evolutionary argument that's going to bring it. And that fact that pharmaceuticals are the number 4 or number 6 cause of death in America. That's pharmaceuticals prescribed in the hospital. And remember, every plant out there probably contains some choline and some folic acid, not necessarily genistein. Most legumes do contain the genistein. But we never got an RDA for choline until just last year. So we keep finding out new vitamins that we need. The folic acid level got raised last year, and it's just, that's what I mean. All of us are probably deficient in one or another thing. And this has become to be more fact than expensive urine. For a few of the herbal alternatives, I've even got dollar cost. And these are slides that I took to Australia. I'm now giving you what I gave in Australia. But I started out with the red clover thing, since they do have this promensil. But red clover tablets would cost about 90 cents a day, unless you go grazing like I do. And then they're free. The tamoxifen runs about $6 a day. Take your choice. I prefer food pharmaceuticals where they're available. But on the run, I'm more liable to take a standardized extract. But at home, I'll take my garlic as it happens in nature. I do not, however, harvest my echinacea. This is a bad poem written, Chemophobia, I call it Synthetic Fears. Tamoxifen's been with us just 25 years. That shows how long ago I wrote it. Only 4 years for raloxifene, but our genes long know the genistein, maybe some 4 million years back when Homo the genus appears. Primates grazing the Rift Valley green, long they've known the genistein. If my love had breast cancer genes, I'd rather she took a bowl of beans, something that her genes have seen. They've never seen tamoxifen. And here is a pretty impressive difference. I've gotten an incredible amount of letters from people who've been helped by milk thistle with various hepatitis and with cirrhosis as well. But interferon has got some terrible side effects, and it's got a terrible cost as well. And milk thistle is a biblical herb, and it's a food pharmaceutical. The seeds of milk thistle are eaten just like sunflower seeds over in some Mediterranean climates. And here you've got much more than this on your handout, so there's no need to look at it. But those 3 pluses again mean that this is a food pharmaceutical. 3 pluses to me means this is safer than coffee, which ain't so safe itself. But I'll give some 1 plus as being more dangerous than coffee, 2 pluses about as safe as coffee, and I confess to having 3 or 4 cups a day. But the 3 pluses is my highest score for safety. And I didn't put the rosemary and the lemon balm and the sage here, but I would certainly be taking them in concert with ginkgo if I were genetically targeted for Alzheimer's, because I think that's one case where you can really decelerate a disease by helping conserve your acetylcholine in the brain. Now, in addition to this, I'd be eating some more of my beans, because beans are one of the best dietary sources of choline, and that choline can be converted to acetylcholine. About 10% of the choline can go through and be used up in the brain. In establishing an RDA for choline last year, they wowed me when they said, in essence, that the beans that my mother ate while I was in the uterus help my memory today. That's been shown in rats. Rats giving higher doses of choline when pregnant, their offspring learn faster and had fewer cognitive defects as they aged. The implication being that in humans, the beans that you eat as a gravid mother may help the memory of your offspring. And there, the ginkgo. Now, the ginkgo is one case where they have concentrated a non-food herbal, and that's why I give it just 2 pluses. I really think when you concentrate it 25 to 50-fold, I would give it just 1 plus, because you've really gotten away from food pharmacy into, you're getting close to pharmaceuticals. But at that level, it can thin your blood dangerously if you're on Coumadin. If you're on, there have been 2 cases reported to me in classes that I teach by nurses whose older patients were on Coumadin for one thing or another, and they heard all the hype about ginkgo helping the memory, so they went out without asking their physician and started taking the ginkgo, and they had bleeding crises. Coumadin is a hardcore anti-aggregant, but the ginkgo is just a gentle one. Now, here's a new routine in my computer that I can do and you can't do, but I can do it for you and email it to you. When you want to know every compound in a plant that might contribute to any disease, this is what I call a multiple activity printout for ginkgo for Alzheimer's. Now, they even say that aspirin can help Alzheimer's because of its anti-aggregant activity. That's why I asked how many anti-aggregate compounds are in ginkgo, and it's quite a few there. Apigenin, ginkgolide B in particular, camphorol, quercetin, which is widespread, the thymol that occurs in the mints that I've mentioned, and then the anti-acetylcholinesterase is the thymol, and anti-complementarity, I don't understand that myself, but apigenin has it and it's useful in Alzheimer's. Mark somebody else's word for it. The anti-inflammatories, there are quite a few of those, and they too can help with Alzheimer's. Antioxidants slow the degradation in the brain, and all of those compounds are in this one herb. And there again, that's why I think the herb is liable to help you in many different directions. I mentioned verapamil as being a calcium blocker that's roughly equivalent to 1 of the 15 calcium blockers in Angelica. And hawthorn is it's a food pharmaceutical too. I have it growing in the garden, in the Angina, arrhythmia plots, and I eat the fruits, and that's really probably the best way to go. But on the road, I don't have fruits but 2 months of the year. On the road, I'll take a standardized extract. It's not a whole lot cheaper than the verapamil, but I think it's much safer. And for flu, the cost differential is pretty heavy still, and I'm taking the echinacea both for the prevention and the management. But usually, if I get it after I've been on echinacea, that's quite rare. That's when I call in the honeysuckle. And there you've seen that one before. And here I've done another multiple activity for the echinacea. What's in echinacea that might contribute to its contribution to colds and flu? Well, it's got some painkillers, the analgesics, borneol, caffeic acid, chlorogenic acid, ferulic acid, and all of the above. It's got the anti-allergic compounds and some anti-flu viral compounds, several antihistaminic compounds, the anti-inflammatory compounds, something for pharyngitis, and quite an array of antiviral compounds, probably working in synergy. And there again, I'm trying to impress upon you one more time that the whole plant is better than the sum of its parts. A little bit out of place, I gave the hawthorn the 3+ because of its food grade status. And here's the early entry for the horse chestnut. I would downgrade that myself to a 1 because the American horse chestnuts and the European horse chestnuts are poisonous. So I'm downgrading that to a 1+, but it's good medicine in the standardized pill, and I think it does prevent these varicose veins. Now, Mrs. Duke went to compression stocking costs, and not only did she get some very expensive stockings, then she had to get a very expensive gadget to get the stockings on, and she was abandoning those. Meanwhile, I'm running around eating pansies and violets. Garlic, clearly, I think, is a great food pharmaceutical, but the director of the Missouri Botanical Garden would have a serious anaphylactic reaction to garlic. He's very seriously allergic to it. So for each chemical out there, somebody's going to have a problem with it. Somebody's going to be allergic to any herb, any phytochemical, or any synthetic chemical. I think your chances are better with the naturals than with the synthetics. Bilberry we've seen enough of, St. John's wort. Here we have a case of the Germans coming in lately and saying it's not hypericin that we should be standardized for. We should be standardized for hyperforin, I think they pronounce it. But I don't care which you standardize, I want both. Because St. John's wort has at least 5 mechanisms by which it's helping depression. One is dopaminergic. That means it's generating some L-dopa. 2, it's generating, of all things, melatonin. That's the first time I've taken melatonin in months was when I got back to California the other day. No, when I got to Utah. I forced myself to stay awake till dark and then took melatonin. But melatonin is generated by the St. John's wort. It also has a catechol O-methyltransferase inhibitor. That means it's increasing the feel-good amines in your body. Most important, perhaps, is it's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Much more important than what we used to think was the major activity. And that is monoamine oxidase inhibition. So it's got 5 different ways by which it's contributing to your antidepressant activity. And that's why I predict it'll turn out just as well as sertraline or Zoloft and with fewer side effects. But here we got everybody's throwing out the warning about do not take with monoamine oxidase inhibitors. I don't say that to my personal counsel, but I have to put it in the literature because it's there, and once these things get in there, it's very difficult to erase it. The Kava, I take rarely, but when we've got some horrible deadlines, writing deadlines, I'll resort to Kava, and it is a mellowing herb. I've never experienced any side effects, but truly people in Polynesia who take it as a recreational drug, and I would have to confess that it is taken sort of recreationally there, can get this yellowing of the skin. Now they have lactating or pregnant women should not use Kava. And almost always you'll find this in all the warnings. But even pharmaceuticals have not been studied for pregnant women and lactating women in many cases, and for children in particular. President Clinton tried to make the pharmaceutical study pediatric uses of pharmaceuticals, and they wouldn't do it. Why should herbs be doing any more of that? And I still think that pediatric and pregnant and lactating women who need medication probably would be better off with the herbal alternative than the synthetic. And the saw palmetto, in nitpicology, you've got to say that if you're going to take saw palmetto, you're male, you should get a PSA test, a prostate-specific antigen test, before you start, because this will lower your PSA readings. Some endocrinologists say that's good, others say that it's bad. But this is based on its alpha reductase inhibitory activity. And remember, evening primrose has that. So a nitpicologist has got to say that against all plants, because cytosterol, which occurs in all plants, also will inhibit alpha reductase. So there you go. A nitpicologist would have to say take a PSA test before taking any herb if you took the nitpicology to its extreme. Evening primrose, turmeric, and it's lunchtime. I did want you to at least see the green pharmacy garden last August when we first set it up. Here we have the 80 plots in the 4 tiers there overlooking the Ginseng Valley, or Yin-Yang Valley, which I'll talk about more at length this afternoon. Next reel of slides will be largely a look at the Amazon. Clearly a self-promoting thing, trying to trick you into coming to the Amazon with me. But there will be more of the synergy and whole herb thing. As a matter of fact, I work for a weird company called allherb.com. And just in case Chris doesn't mention it tomorrow, he too works for allherb.com. And while I was in Australia last week, allherb.com published quickies that I did on the Australian herbs. So it's online an herb a day column. It usually runs the equivalent of a page. So while I was in Australia, we looked at the tea tree, we looked at the eucalyptus, which are the most famous of the Australian herbs. But I'll bet most of you have taken eucalyptus one way or the other. But the most surprising route is that when you take Smith's cough drops, or many of the cough drops, you're getting eucalyptol, which is largely cineole, C-I-N-E-O-L-E. But I mention that allherb.com because it's an old Japanese entrepreneur, and he made millions by making what they call the wacky wall walker. It's like an octopus. You throw it on the wall and it sort of crawls down. And now he's reinvesting his millions into the herb business. For years, he and I would go out to lunch every day and figure out how he's going to reinvest his millions. And at first he wanted to go into formulations, and of course you're with the experts in formulations here with David and Fawn, and then tomorrow Chris Hobbs is also an expert in formulation. But this Japanese entrepreneur, Ken Hakuta, has been promoting herbs and carries herbs online. He hopes to be the Amazon bookstore of online herb sales. But as one of his gimmicks, he had Christopher Hobbs formulate this Yin-Yang woe that I mentioned. And that's another part of my garden I didn't discuss at length. I want to tell you one thing. I have a valley that I call Phenology Valley. And in the old Chinese tradition, you have, in this hemisphere at least, you have a north-facing slope, which is, where's north here? You have a north-facing slope. This would be a north-facing slope, which would be the colder slope, and that is usually the yin slope. And then you got the south-facing slope, or the yang slope. And I just happen to have one of those at the bottom of my farm that I showed you there. And I have wrapped around each other there a smilax or sarsaparilla, which I consider a yang herb. And then I have a wild yam, which I consider a yin herb. So, strangely, I found them in the forest wrapped around each other that way, the yin and the yang. Now, I'm skeptical on many counts, but on one of our Belize eco tours, I was with some dowsers, and I'm openly questionable about whether dowsing works or not. But the old gentleman who was carrying, he's even older than I am, who was carrying on the dowsing, said he could sex an herb with his dowsing machine. And coincidentally, we found a Dioscorea or wild yam, a huge one down there. And I didn't tell him what it was or anything. And then right 20 feet away, I saw a smilax or sarsaparilla, another huge one. And was thinking, well, here's a good test. So without anyone in the class except me knowing that one was clearly yin and the other was clearly yang, he went with his dowsers, and boy, it came out just right. I'm less skeptical about dowsing now, but the yang came out for the smilax, and the yin came out for the Dioscorea. I'm still skeptical, but less skeptical. But so then when I learned, after looking into this yin and yang, well, let's talk about the folklore there. How many of you have heard of wild yam cream with a natural progesterone? You sell it, I'm sure. Now, here's the big question. I might offend a few people here, but most of the chemists to whom I talk say wild yam does not itself contain progesterone. Wild yam does, however, contain diosgenin, D-I-O-S-G-E-N-I-N. Matter of fact, it's named after wild yam, which is Dioscorea. And diosgenin itself can be converted to progesterone or testosterone or whatever hormone you want with 4 or 5 steps. But the human body apparently doesn't do that. And you may have seen ads in some of the macho magazines, muscle-bound guys saying, get your natural testosterone, take sarsaparilla. And the implication being there, and matter of fact, it used to be stated that sarsaparilla contained testosterone. I can't back that up, but it too contains diosgenin, which can be converted to the testosterone. So you can imagine my fascination with finding the sarsaparilla, the so-called yang, all twisted around with the smilax, or the Dioscorea or the yin herb. And I gave a potted pair of yin and yang to Dr. Monroe Wall, who was one of the first to discover that these diosgenin compounds can be converted into all of the other hormones. He's 80 now. He's also the gentleman who discovered Taxol, the compound that was discovered from you in 1992. Discovered much earlier, but approved for ovarian cancer in 1992. Since I've mentioned that, let me add that in my garden, back there at home, there are starter materials for $4 billion drugs. The wild yam is one of them, and it's native there. As a matter of fact, it was Russell Marker, one state up from me in Pennsylvania, who back in the 40s realized that we were getting all our hormones from pregnant mare's urine, like Premarin, and realized that this was pretty expensive. And it was he who looked at the wild yam native to Pennsylvania and Maryland and found the diosgenin, and he, who with others, on the basis of this, founded the whole pharmaceutical firm Syntex. It's under another name now, but based on this discovery of a cheap route to the hormones. But that is native to my backyard, and my house came with over 50 specimens of Taxus, or U, and all U's that have been analyzed contain Taxol. So that sold for $1 billion just last year alone. And the mayapple I showed you in the little book is part of my eastern deciduous forest floor. And the etoposide from mayapple sold for $400,000 last year. And I'll sing about that in a little bit when I find 4 of you asleep. 1984, that was approved for testicular cancer, and then 1986, it was approved for the small cell lung cancer. And what's the other $1 billion drug in my backyard? There I'm cheating a little bit more. It's the Madagascar periwinkle, which I have in my leukemia and lymphoma plots. And way back in the 40s, Eli Lilly discovered that its experimental rats were dying when they were studying the Madagascar periwinkle for diabetes. And they looked at their rats and found that they didn't have any white corpuscles. And then the light bulb went off. Well, maybe if this Madagascar periwinkle is killing the white corpuscles, it might be useful in leukemia. And that's where vincristine and vinblastine got their start over 40 years ago. And for years, they were worth $100 million a year. Now, this is an incredible story in one other sense. That one species, the Madagascar periwinkle, has been the fountain of over 500 different alkaloids, that one species. And poor Madagascar never made a nickel out of this, although when I was last there, they were exporting their periwinkle to France, where they were using it in homeopathic preparations. And they were also exporting their Centella asiatica, or gotu kola. And while I was in Australia, the gotu kola was getting a lot of press over there. It's become a weed in parts over there, and they're using it as a cerebral stimulant under the name Brahmi, the Ayurvedic herb Brahmi. But I bring up those $4 billion drugs in my backyard. Remember I said the Amazon rainforest, where I'll take you to shortly, contains 50 times more woody species. If you come down there with me, you'll find suspension bridges between the tops of the trees there. And there are 13, and one of the trees there was unknown to science. So your life depends upon a species we don't know what is yet. We're still waiting for it to come into flower and fruit, so we can tell you. Well, you remember I told you I went down with a slip disc the first time, and because I had a slip disc, I was barefooted in the jungle. And I encountered in the jungle Jim Duke barefooted and with a cervical collar, quite a spectacle in the rainforest. I encountered my shaman, hanging from a tree barefooted. And he had never seen a gringo walking through the forest barefooted, and I'd never seen a Native American hanging from a tree barefooted. So we bonded immediately. It turns out he was climbing the trees there to sort of scout the route for this aerial tramway that we have there. And that was his major job for a couple of years. He's been working there off and on for 30 years. He's done everything from rubber collecting to what have you. But he latched onto the idea real soon of making his botanical garden. But remember, that's the least studied forest and the most diverse. If we can find $4 billion drugs up in my well-studied backyard, how many do we lose if we let that Amazonian rainforest disappear? And that's why I devoted my sunrise years, 1, to getting a fair shake for the herbal alternative, and 2, to saving that piece of the forest, because there are answers to diseases there that we don't even know yet. And that diversity, each species, remember, is a unique chemical factory. That's not the way my shaman sees it. He sees these other types of spirits, but that's the way I see it. And each species shares hundreds of chemicals with each other species, but each species also has some unique chemicals. And it's those things that we lose if we let the forest disappear. A gentleman, Rodolfo Vasquez, and the late Al Gentry climbed many of those trees to get specimens to show that, yes, there were 300 woody species on a hectare there. So that's, I think, one of the most critical forests to save in the world. And as I'll show you in the slides later, in that area, Brazil nut and rubber, over a 10-year period, harvested from the standing forest, will return more dollars than if you cut down the forest and replace it with McDonald's machines or cows or with soybeans. And I should add that soybean is not native to Brazil, but it's one of their major crops. It's not native to the U.S. It's one of our major crops. And it is an annual species. Agriculture tends to force us towards the annuals. Like chamomile, at least one of the chamomiles is an annual species. And for reasons I don't fully understand, we tend to get away from the perennial species. and go for these annual species, especially with mechanized agriculture. But if you chop down that rainforest and replace it with soybean, you might make more dollars over 2 or 3 years, but not over that full 10-year span. And the cattle, maybe 2 or 3 years, but at the end of the 10 years, your forest would be gone, your capital would be gone, and you'd have almost a desert where this immense green forest was. So they're both aesthetic and selfish reasons to keep the rainforest. When I first went there, our Native American guides denied their Native Americanness, just like many North American Indians in decades past denied their American Indian heritage. But I think they saw, as all of our gringo tourists came down, that we were interested in their culture, their medicinal plants and everything. Almost all of them will now say, yes, I'm Kokama, or yes, I'm Yagua. They will confess to this. And more than important than this, their children are seeing these gringos gaping at the Native Americans and their architecture, their blowguns, the things that are of interest to us, and saying, well, maybe I could make more money learning what my parents know than going and selling McDonald's burgers back in Iquitos. And there are McDonald's there, or just like McDonald's. So our ecotourism, although it's a double-edged sword, is sort of teaching them that the standing forest means more to them than what they could replace it with. They're learning that the monkey that they shoot with their blowgun to eat as a potted meat is more valuable on the hoof than in the pot. And this is, I think, good. It's hard to save forest in Oregon, it's hard to save forest in Peru. But when you can convince people of the economic value of that forest, you have a better chance. And it's been a great experience doing that. Before we drift off to the slides, though, and this will be taking you to Latin America, I'd like to ask if you had any questions from this morning that I might help you with. Yes?
I have one as far as when you mentioned some of the herbs going by the railroad tracks. I mean, how safe is it to really use those, even if they weren't treated with pesticides, knowing that there's so many trains coming back and forth?
Down in Peru, I've seen people eat strawberries between plane tracks, and I can't think of any better way to pick up internal intestinal parasites. They don't treat the sewage in the trains there. That's up here. If I were looking for herbicide-resistant herbs, I would go along the railroad right-of-ways. Now, I'm told, and this is contrary to what I used to believe, that along a highway you don't get much lead in the vegetables there. And that's where I get most of my evening primrose seed when I'm harvesting seed. The pesticides along railroad tracks were mostly herbicides to keep the right-of-way clean, but that's not what you're driving at. What?
I mean mostly like environmental pollutants, anything, whether it's applied or whether it's just in the environment. How much of an effect does that have on the plant itself?
This is going to surprise you, and I had not intended to bring it out, but an abused herb has more medicine on average than a pampered herb. If I beat a tree of many species, it will have proportionally more chemicals than an unbeaten tree. If I take a bite out of a leaf, that leaf and leaves next to it will increase the very phytochemicals that we use for medicine. If I abuse it with chemicals, stress it with chemicals, stress it with salt, it will have more secondary metabolites proportionate to primary. Now, I hope Chris will cover this tomorrow. I don't usually get into primary metabolites, but that's your proteins and sugars and the things that are necessary for the life of the plant. And then these secondary metabolites that we call medicines are often dead-end compounds that don't necessarily have a direct use to the plant except in protecting it from its enemies. So salt along the road will make that plant a little bit more medicinal. Mulleins do very well along railroad tracks, and so do evening primroses, and I suspect that they've been stressed by various chemicals, and I suspect that they would have proportionally less protein and oil and more of the biochemicals of interest. An organic, now this is going to make some of you mad, but I think an organically grown medicinal plant is not necessarily a good thing. I think if you don't fertilize it and don't take good care of it, it'll have proportionally more of the medicine and less of those things we use for food. So I'm not as adamant about organically grown medicinal plants as I am about organically grown foods. That's a weird place to have arrived, but I have gotten there. Most of you might not think that plants communicate with each other, but I'll give you another example based in this time on salicylates. You can have tobacco plants growing in the greenhouse, separated from each other, only able to contact through the atmosphere. And a bug comes in and takes a bite out of one of those tobacco plants. That particular bitten plant converts some of its salicylates into methyl salicylate. Now what's that? That's the active ingredient in wintergreen, tea-berry gum. That's what you smell. That's methyl salicylate. Unlike the other volatiles, unlike the other salicylate, that is volatile. And that'll go across the screen and tell the next tobacco plant that the bugs are here. And then those next tobacco plants will raise their levels of anti-bug compounds. In the Harvard forest, one plant gets infected by a fungus, and it tells the next tree, hey, I got a fungus, you better get ready, the fungi are coming. In Africa, there's some giraffes have learned to eat these thorny acacias. It's pretty tricky. They're pretty tough plants. But that acacia will tell the next plant that the giraffes are here, and then that plant gets more bitter, so it's not as attractive to the giraffe. So plants do communicate by these secondary metabolites. This is probably the spaciest thing I've said, but all of this is backed up in journals like Science. So plants do communicate often with these secondary metabolites that we use as medicine. Let's get more specific on Genistein, which we've talked about at length today. The estrogenic isoflavone in most of the legumes. If you have an alfalfa sprout, it will have a given level of Genistein, probably about 10 times as much as in the seed. But if it gets hit by a fungus, it will have 100 times more Genistein. The Genistein, as I mentioned this morning, is a fungicide, and when that sprout is hit by a fungicide, hit by a fungus, it augments its fungicidal compounds, trying to slow the growth of the fungus. Matter of fact, getting real heretical, I suspect that it's mung bean sprouts more than soybeans that are responsible for the difference in orientals and occidentals in their incidence of breast cancer, hot flashes, and the like, because they eat a lot of mung bean sprouts, and I doubt that they're clean, and I'll bet that a dirty mung bean sprout will have more Genistein than the soy. Of the soy products, the miso, a fermentation product, and bacterially or fungally fermented, would probably have more Genistein than the straight soybean, to protect it from that fungus that's converting it to miso, or that bacteria. So what else can we do to a plant to abuse it? Well, the chemical toxins, they will take many of those up. And clearly lots of things have been dumped along the railroad track. Cadmium might be there. This is the place where you want to do your harvest, in a place like this. And how do you clean up a dirty herb from an herbal environment? I don't know. But roadside grazing I discourage. But when you're taking the seeds of an annual like evening primrose, I don't think you will get much contamination. On the other hand, if you're taking the herbage and the roots, you might be getting a lot of things that the plant may concentrate from the environment. Some plants deconcentrate, others concentrate. When we get to the Brazil nut, which we will get to, Brazil nut is the world's best known source of selenium. 3 average Brazil nuts will give you the 200 micrograms a day of selenium. That is predicted to spare you the 3 cancers I'm most liable to get. That's lung cancer because I was a heavy smoker for 4 decades, prostate cancer because I'm a male, and colon cancer because of my genes. There's even a cancer tumor line that bears my name, Duke. I don't know how close kin it is to me. My father and 2 of his brothers retired at age 65 and died at age 65 of cancer of the colon. That's why I waited till I was 66 to retire, and didn't really retire. But I've been a high fiber freak for 30 years, thinking that that would prevent the colon cancer. Then last year, the Journal of the New England Journal said high fiber didn't prevent colon cancer. This did not change my opinion, and I still continue to ingest a whole lot of anti-carcinogens. I certainly didn't answer your question, but I did tell you about secondary and primary metabolites.
Did you say 3 nuts a day?
3 nuts a day, yeah. 3 Brazil nuts a day, if they're average, would give you 210 micrograms of selenium. And nothing comes close to that. For some reason, Brazil nut and the Brazil nut family accumulate selenium. Now, out west, you're not as liable to be deficient in selenium as I am out east. And you can overdose on selenium. If you ate 100 Brazil nuts, your hair might fall out, and you might smell of garlic from getting too much selenium. But there again, the homeostatic human body tries to keep you within reasonable bounds for these things with which it co-evolved. And it's got homeostatic mechanisms for moving equations in one direction or the other, trying to keep you in balance. And there again, the herbs that you take give it a whole menu of things to work with, whereas the silver bullet is just that one compound, and that single compound out of context is much more liable to alter those thousands of equations that constitute you. Other questions? Yeah, Andrew.
You mentioned the wild yam and the sarsaparilla, and I've read a lot about how the precursors break down the digestive system.
Okay.
What do you know about it?
About diosgenin itself?
Yeah.
I do not know what it breaks down to. I just know that they all tell me it is not converted to progesterone or testosterone.
Why would they say that?
Because they have no evidence for it. And Stephen Dentale, a California botanist whom I respect, and when they say wild yam with natural progesterone, progesterone is natural. But most of the wild yam creams with progesterone, I think, are Upjohn's progesterone. If you don't believe me, contact, I believe it's Freddie Cronenberg at Columbia University. And most of these things are spiked with natural progesterone, but Upjohn's progesterone. And it wasn't the wild yam that made it. Now, diosgenin, that precursor, occurs in hundreds of plants. And John Lee in California said that progesterone was made by 5,000 plants. I have yet to find it in all of my database accumulation, progesterone. I do find the estrone, I do find testosterone, and strangely melatonin among the hormones, but I don't find progesterone in plants. I can't answer what happens in the gut, but Steve Dentale and Freddie tell me that you don't manufacture progesterone from diosgenin if you ingest it. Now, when I tell this to a bunch of feminists up in the Catskills, they almost throw their yams at me because they're making their own wild yam creams and they're getting progesteronic effects. And I think that's because diosgenin itself has mild estrogenic and progesteronic effects. But they don't get real progesterone. But clearly they are just using the wild yam blended up in their own machine, and they're getting the balance they want from that wild yam cream without the spiked progesterone. Well, that's the yin and yang of it. Tomorrow Chris will be here, And my friend who runs allherb.com, hinting at synergy there, the whole herb, that's the theme of our program today, and that's why I stress this thing is called all herb. He wanted to say all rather than whole herb because that gets him closer to the front of the alphabet. That's the way Amazon.com and all those people play the game. But he's a great believer in synergy. But he's also got a great sense of humor. And when I told him about Yin Yang in my valley and all the Dioscorea smilax, and then I told him that the name of epimedium is Yin Yang Wo. And I said, my goodness, that must mean male-female herb. But a Chinese friend said, no, Duke, you're wrong. That means horny goat weed. It depends on where you put the accent there. Yin Yang Ho does not mean male-female. It means horny goat. And I speculate that my deer are reproducing faster than I am because they're eating all my ginseng. But they are not eating my horny goat weed, I'm happy to say. And when Chris gets here tomorrow, you might ask him about how to extract the Yin Yang Ho, because he made for allherb.com some tinctures of the Yin Yang Ho. And I have 60 accessions cloned, so that I've got one of the pair on the yin side of the slope and the other on the yang side of the slope. And then I'll get them analyzed next year. They're too valuable to analyze this year, to see if they have any of this phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitory activity, which is the mechanism behind Viagra. So far, I would bet on yohimbe, the herb, and its alkaloid, yohimbine, but that's a rather dangerous alkaloid with a lot of side effects. Garlic, strangely, I'm talking aphrodisiacs now, garlic is one of the best sources of free arginine. And free arginine is supposed to stimulate the flow of blood into the corpus cavernosum, much as Viagra does stimulate the flow of blood there. So garlic is among the candidates for this herbal Viagra. As sunflower is also a very good seed of that, source of arginine, as is garlic. Any more questions? Otherwise, we're going to head to the Amazon. Before we go to the Amazon, I'd like to suggest that I think we are getting back to the green medicines here as time progresses. And one, because the herbs are helping, and two, because the pharmaceuticals are hurting. And I think that we'll find little by little many more Americans, including their physicians, will be taking these things. And here, because of this huge variation within the herbs, I suspect standardized but whole herb extracts will be showing up more and more. I'm not here to recommend or discourage the so-called pharma print, where they give you quantitative data on several of the active ingredients. But since I do believe that nature will have favored synergy among them, I think that the pharma print may be a thing of the future. And again, proven that all of the major compounds are there, such that you don't have spiked sawdust with 3% hypericum. And the fear of the synthetics is probably going to speed up this transition here. And this again is why I speak of these as millennial medicines. Most of the major herbs that are on sale, the European herbs at any rate, have been with us for millennia. And in the Bible you will find at least 30 that you hear about being sold here in the U.S. That would make them at least bimillennial medicinals. And I mentioned the homeostasis. This is why I think silver bullets are dangerous, and why I think the herbal approach, the whole herb approach, is giving you a whole menu, your body and all its homeostatic equations, a whole menu of chemicals from which to select that which it needs, and more religiously almost to keep out those that it doesn't need. But that's what those homeostatic equations are doing. One more look at the garden. That's last year. It looks like a garden this year that solarized it to get rid of the weeds. This used to be a blackberry weed patch, and it's been organic since I've been there in 1972. Organic in the sense that we have not sprayed or anything. On the other hand, it's heavily manured, and for that reason, I'm getting a lot more. This used to be pasture before it was briar patch. I've got feverfews as tall as I am. I have valerians as tall as I am. And I think that's the organic implication. They're huge, but proportionally they're less medicinal than if it had not been so well fertilized with the sheep manure and the horse manure that preceded my farm here. Now, you heard me, I don't know that I told you that I bet my hair several years ago that rosemary shampoo would do as well for Alzheimer's as Tacrine, the first approved drug. But I also bet my prostate gland that saw palmetto would do as well for old man's prostate as finasteride, the first FDA-approved drug for benign prostatic hypertrophy. Believe it or not, that was only approved about 1992, the same year when the FDA said saw palmetto could not be recommended for prostate. In other words, they took finasteride and said no to saw palmetto. The reason they do that is because no one had come forth to offer proof. And the reason they didn't do that is because it takes $500 million to prove a new drug safe and efficacious. Seminole Indians have been eating this for millennia, and I don't know that they've ever had prostate problems, but it was not classically used by them for prostate, as the Journal of the American Medical Association said. But for millennia, they have been ingesting. Well, I did bet in front of a whole bunch of FDA people and NIH people that the saw palmetto would do as well as finasteride. And I got 3 phone calls after that lecture, and I was afraid. I was still with the USDA, and I was afraid it was going to be some old stodgy FDA employee giving me a bad time for using the public podium. But no, these were older dudes, and they wanted to know how much saw palmetto to use. That's sort of like the FDA woman who came up to me talking about the evening primrose this morning, which she was using for PMS. But I told them that I made what I call chestnut butter, in allusion to the pharmaceutical, which is Prosgar. Chestnut butter contains originally it just had saw palmetto, which stinks. Chestnut butter contains 5 American Indian food plants. Black bean, which contains the Genistein, which is anti-prostatidic. The Brazil nut, which I just mentioned, an American Indian food plant, which has that selenium, which is good for the prostate. The saw palmetto, that's 3. The evening primrose, which only last year or the year before was discovered to have anti-prostatidic activity, and the American Indian pumpkin seed. Actually, today I don't even use the saw palmetto because I don't like it, but I can blend up the others to make quite a good butter. But I much prefer just to eat the pumpkin seed. And on the road, I am taking a saw palmetto standardized product, which is the lazy way out, but on the road you can't. Instead of celery seed, I can take 4 celery stalks a day and prevent my gout. But I don't want to take 36 stalks of celery to Africa with me. So I pop my standardized extract. It takes 60 milligrams of sitosterol, S-I-T-O-S-T-E-R-O-L, to have the effect on benign prostatic hypertrophy as enough to alleviate the symptoms. Without analyzing each of those, I wouldn't know how much sitosterol you're getting, but all of those seeds are good sources of sitosterol. And the standardized saw palmetto product is standardized for its sterols. Chestnut butter probably varies 20-fold as relates to its sterols, and that's why for other people I would recommend a standardized extract, but if you're eating plenty of pumpkin seeds, your body will keep you in bounds there. Pumpkin seed are the easy way to go. See, this attempts to show you the several ways in which the saw palmetto is working. You'll remember this morning I mentioned the inhibition of alpha reductase, and that prevents the conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone. It's also accomplished by the GLA, the gamma-linolenic acid in the evening primrose oil. And this is another enzyme that's involved in the hormones. And all of these different ways in which saw palmetto, the natural product, is helping alleviate the benign prostatic hypertrophy. Now remember, I did bet my prostate gland back about 1992. And since then, there have been several clinical trials in Germany that have shown that the saw palmetto does just as well as finasteride, the one I bet against, and has fewer side effects. And that's why I predict that's going to be the outcome on the majority of those herbal alternatives. If you give them a fair trial, they will prove to be almost or as good, but with fewer side effects. That, coupled with being cheaper and environmentally more friendly, makes it the way to go, and why I think the millennium will be much greener. Now let's get to Latin America. Remember I said this morning that Christopher Columbus set out looking for black Indians and black pepper and found instead the red pepper. Another one I love from Brazil and have grown in my greenhouse here that's strictly in Latin America is jabarangi. Jabarangi is the Tupi Indian word that means that makes you slobber. And that is the source of the drug pilocarpine. It's scientifically, the genus is Pilocarpus. Pilocarpine has been a drug of choice for glaucoma for many years, but I was sent to Brazil to look for the jabarangi by an ophthalmologist who said, well, that's on the wane as far as glaucoma is concerned, but it really does help with dry mouth syndrome. As a matter of fact, pilocarpine augments the flow of saliva tenfold. And that's why I'm impressed with that, because the old Indian name, jabarangi, tells you exactly what the FDA is going to require 3 years of experimental trial to prove that it does, in fact, augment the flow of saliva. But it will be proved out for dry mouth syndrome, which is a side effect of about 25% of pharmaceuticals, and is a problem in everyone my age, or at least 25% of males, males and females over 65. But here's the one some of us got to talking about at lunch. It was a great, here you're seeing some of the major drugs from Latin America over there. The coca has been used there by the Native Americans for at least 4,000 years. So we could think of that as a millennial drug. Andy Weil and I have both worked with the cocaine growers in Latin America, or the coca growers, I should say. And I have yet to see an Indian get addicted to chewing the coca leaf. I've seen Indians who could carry me on their back all day and with no other substance except the coca quid in his mouth. Now, last night you had a great Somali here. The Somali coke is called khat, Q-A-T or K-H-A-T, and it's another central nervous system stimulant with 2 alkaloids, caffeine and cathinone, which will get you high wired and cut off your appetite. Now, if you come with me on an eco tour to Peru and go to the Andes, and if you're obese, I've lost a little weight, but if you chew your coca at 11 o'clock at noon, before noon, you won't be hungry at lunchtime. It's anorectic. It curbs the appetite. But it's not just one alkaloid in there. There are at least 12. And Andy Weil and I both predict that they will all prove to be anorectic and much better for curbing the appetite in synergy than isolated like pure cocaine, and much less liable to do damage. proof for this comes from a patent in Oxford, Mississippi, where they patented a cocaine-free extract of coca leaf for curbing the appetite. So that shows that even after you've taken the cocaine out, there are other anorectic alkaloids there. Coca-Cola still imports to Rahway, New Jersey, decocainized coca leaf, and it's in Coca-Cola. The genius of this is great because the coca contains cocaine, cocaine, the central nervous system stimulant, and the cola, a nut from Africa, I don't think it shows on this one, contained caffeine. So you had a double whammy in the original Coca-Cola, caffeine and cocaine. Maybe that's why my dad said when he was taking me down to get a fountain Coke, his word for it was, let's go down and get a dope. Because in the early 1900s, Coca-Cola did contain cocaine. It no longer does. Jokingly, what's Dr. Warfler, is it, that was with you last night? I would suggest we could have done just as well with Catha Cola, because Catha is the scientific name of his central nervous stimulant, COT, and it works in the same circuitry as the cocaine. But there, Caucasians never experienced capsaicin until after Columbus got here. And that's interesting because we haven't had much genetic experience with it. And some people are allergic to it. Matter of fact, there's a Childers diet for arthritis. Here I've been suggesting it for the pain of arthritis. The Childers diet says stay away from the nightshade family to prevent your arthritis. And most of the nightshade family weren't ingested by anyone except American Indians until Columbus. Hot pepper, Native American. Potato, Native American. Tomato, Native American. Nicotiana, tobacco, Native American with a few outliers in Australia. I'll have to admit that some of us eggplants in that family, but not many of us eat too much of that. But there could be something. I really believe that 10% of arthritics will be helped by doing without the nightshade family. Zooming in, I show also the quinine there. And David and I were talking about this coming up the hill. Quinine is native sort of between Machu Picchu and the Amazon at mid-altitudes. But the bark of the quinine contains at least 20 alkaloids. Had we stuck with the whole bark, I don't think we would have quinine-resistant malaria today. But when we took out the pure quinine, that enabled the mosquito to develop a tolerance for it. Had we stuck with the whole mixture of the 20 alkaloids, I would wager that that would not have evolved. Here's the cacao that I mentioned. And cacao is the source of the theophylline, theobromine, and the caffeine, or chocolate as it's known. And all modern muscle relaxants, according to the British Medical Journal, are derived from the American Indian blow dart poison. And I'll show you a little bit of that. The Indians where I go can hit a monkey at 30 meters with his blowgun, and on the tip of that dart is poison made from the bark of the curare. And he could save that monkey, giving him artificial respiration, because his respiratory muscles are paralyzed. But rarely does he do that. Ipecac is another one from both South America and Latin America, which contains several, not just one, alkaloid that have emetic and anti-amoebal activity. Now this morning I mentioned the dragon's blood, sangre de drago, and you'll see more of it. This is the croton that emanates that blood that will speed up curing in many. Now, on my first trip to the Amazon, I devoted my week to the papaya tree because, remember, I had a slip disc. Only in 1988, for the first time, was chymopapain approved for dissolving slip disc. They would inject this proteolytic enzyme from the papaya into the extruded disc matter. They would have about 1 in 4,000 anaphylactic fatalities, but remember, that's better than average. There are 3 in 1,000 killed by the drugs they receive in the hospital. But I dedicated my week to papaya, thinking that perhaps I would be using chymopapine for the slip disc. As it was, I got out of the woods with acupuncture and didn't need any further treatment, although I went through the cervical fusion because that was free. I had to pay for my acupuncture and for my ultrasound, but the $50,000 operation, which was useless, was covered by the HMO.